Tariffs weren't just taxes, they were shockwaves. When Trump's trade war targeted Canada, it wasn't just political posturing. It hit hard steel, aluminum, even maple syrup came under fire. One of the most stable trade relationships in the world suddenly became a battlefield. So, what does a country do when its biggest trading partner turns up the heat? Fold or fight back? Canada chose something bolder: escape velocity. It turned outward. New allies, new lifelines, new deals, and the outcome. Some of the world's most unexpected nations stepped in when the US stepped out. The question now isn't how Canada survived, but who helped it win. You'll be surprised who showed up and who's quietly replacing America as Canada's closest economic partner. If you want real global stories backed by facts, not noise, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that bell for more insight. Let's break it down. When Donald Trump launched a wave of aggressive tariffs targeting Canadian steel and aluminum, slapping on a punishing 25% tax, Canada's economy was suddenly on the front lines of a trade war. But while the headlines focused on Washington and Ottawa's verbal sparring, something far more strategic was happening quietly across the Atlantic. Years earlier, Canada had signed a deal most people forgot about: the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, with the European Union. That agreement became a lifeline. By the time the tariffs took full effect, Canadian exports to Europe had begun to skyrocket. By 2023, trade had surged by more than 25%, crossing the $50 billion mark for the first time. What made this shift remarkable wasn't just the numbers, it was the nature of the goods. Canadian companies weren't just selling raw lumber or crude oil. They were exporting high-grade seafood, advanced medical devices, aerospace parts, and premium agricultural products like organic lentils, maple syrup, and canola oil. Even more impressive was how small Canadian businesses got in on the action. Over 1,000 small and medium-sized enterprises, most of which had previously never sold outside North America, began shipping products to countries like France, Germany, and the Netherlands. Thanks to CETA's reduced tariffs and simplified regulatory rules, these businesses gained access to a consumer base of over 447 million people. And it wasn't a one-way street. European investors began eyeing Canada's clean energy and green tech sectors, with notable investments in Quebec's battery production and British Columbia's sustainable forestry projects. It was the kind of mutually beneficial partnership that trade experts dream about but rarely see in action. While Trump was busy raising trade barriers, Europe laid out a welcome mat. Canada didn't just walk through that open door, it ran. And today, that quiet pivot is transforming Canada's economic future, one container ship at a time. What do you think about these shifts? Drop a comment below and join the conversation mainstream media avoids. And there it found one of the most reliable, stable, and strategically aligned trade partners in the world: Japan. The two countries had already laid the foundation with the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership (CPTPP). But it was the economic chaos under Trump that made that partnership suddenly urgent and extremely valuable. Between 2018 and 2024, Canadian exports to Japan surged 38%, reaching over $17 billion annually. And this wasn't just a jump in numbers, it was a transformation in what Canada was exporting and how it was viewed in Japanese markets. Traditional products like canola oil, wheat, and pork found eager buyers, but so did advanced Canadian goods, aerospace components, clean energy systems, and even artificial intelligence solutions. At the same time, Japan saw Canada as a solution to a growing concern: stability. While tensions with China simmered and the US grew increasingly unpredictable, Canada offered a rules-based, transparent English-speaking market with access to critical resources. That included everything from rare earth elements to battery-grade nickel key to Japan's electric vehicle ambitions. Canadian companies also began tapping into Japan's tech and electronics sector, forging partnerships that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Joint ventures in robotics, AI, and hydrogen energy took shape in both Tokyo and Toronto. But beyond numbers and contracts, this trade alliance was built on something rare: trust. Japan valued Canada's regulatory clarity and environmental standards, and Canada valued Japan's long-term investment mindset and commitment to fairness. While Trump's tariffs shook the North American economy, Japan stepped in with precision and calm. It didn't make headlines, it didn't make threats, it made deals. And those deals are now quietly reshaping the Pacific trade balance, with Canada as a central player. For a country looking to rebuild after economic shock, Japan wasn't just a partner, it became a pillar of trade diversification and a symbol of what smart alliances can achieve. When most people think of Canada's trade partners, Indonesia probably doesn't come to mind. But behind the scenes, a powerful new alliance is quietly taking shape. In late 2024, Canada signed a landmark deal known as the Canada-Indonesia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, unlocking one of the fastest-growing markets in the world and making a bold move far from North America. Indonesia isn't just any developing nation. It's the fourth most populous country on Earth, and it's projected to become the world's fourth largest economy by 2045. For Canada, this wasn't just about diversifying exports, it was about future-proofing its economy. And the results came fast. Canadian agricultural exports surged almost overnight. Shipments of wheat lentils, canola oil, and even maple syrup began flowing into Indonesian ports. But the trade wasn't limited to food. Canada also tapped into Indonesia's growing need for green energy solutions, telecommunications infrastructure, and educational services. By early 2025, Canadian companies were opening new offices in Jakarta, Bandung, and Surabaya cities with exploding middle-class demand and increasing appetite for high-quality international goods. What caught many analysts off guard was the speed of change. While traditional markets in Europe and the US were bogged down in tariff battles and political friction, Indonesia offered something rare: openness, momentum, and opportunity. For Canada, this meant not just exporting more, but doing it with less risk and higher margins. At the same time, Indonesia's young tech-savvy population saw Canadian products as premium and trustworthy. Canadian universities reported a sharp rise in Indonesian student enrollments, while joint ventures in clean technology and agriculture took off almost immediately. Canada had made a smart pivot. When pressure mounted from Trump-era tariffs, it looked east not just to survive, but to thrive. And Indonesia, once overlooked, quickly became a billion-dollar ally in Canada's global transformation. But the next country on this list might surprise you even more. It didn't grab headlines. There were no dramatic press conferences or political standoffs. But while the world watched Canada's battles with Trump's tariffs unfold, Australia quietly became one of Canada's most important trade allies and a model of long-term, low-drama economic cooperation. By 2024, bilateral trade between Canada and Australia had grown over 30%, reaching more than $4.2 billion annually. But unlike many of Canada's newer trade relationships, this one wasn't forged in crisis. It was deepened by shared values, mutual respect, and strategic alignment. Both countries are CPTPP members. Both are resource-rich democracies, and both face similar geopolitical challenges in the Asia-Pacific region. The trade portfolio is surprisingly broad. Canada exports to Australia include pharmaceuticals, mining technology, aerospace parts, educational services, and industrial machinery. In return, Australian investors have begun pouring capital into Canadian clean energy, agritech, and AI sectors, helping to diversify Canada's economy just as it faced mounting pressure from the United States. But what truly defines this partnership is its role in the global climate transition. Both governments have committed to net zero emissions by 2050, and that shared mission is fueling massive joint ventures in green hydrogen, carbon capture, electric battery production, and sustainable agriculture. These aren't hypothetical projects, they're billion-dollar industries in the making, with Canada and Australia at the center. Beyond trade, the two nations are also strengthening educational and research partnerships. Dual degree programs between Canadian and Australian universities are on the rise, helping to build a workforce fluent in innovation, climate science, and international business. It's not just about moving goods, it's about building a shared future. While Trump's tariffs shook global trade, Canada and Australia quietly chose another path: calm, deliberate, and strategic. No chaos, no retaliation, just smart moves that are now paying off in real numbers and real stability. In a turbulent world, Australia didn't just help Canada survive, it helped it build something better. Canada didn't collapse under pressure. It adapted, diversified, and rose stronger than ever. These 10 countries didn't just patch the holes left by a broken alliance, they helped Canada rewire its global trade network for a new era. From Asia to Latin America, from clean energy to advanced tech, this isn't just recovery, it's reinvention. The US may have started the trade war, but it was Canada that found a smarter way forward. If this gives you a new perspective, like the video, drop a comment and subscribe to Huge Battle for more untold stories behind the headlines. While headlines fixated on the fallout between Canada and the United States, a quiet transformation was unfolding just to the south. Mexico, often seen as America's junior trade partner, stepped up as Canada's unexpected stabilizer in a region rattled by tariffs, supply chain shocks, and rising political friction. Under the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, CUSMA, also known as USMCA, Canada and Mexico maintained a powerful framework for open trade even as U.S. relations grew tense. And in 2024, Canadian exports to Mexico hit a record $122.4 billion, fueled by booming demand for machinery, aerospace components, agri-food products, and industrial inputs. But this wasn't just about surviving America's tariff squeeze. It was about building a parallel supply chain, one that could keep moving even if the U.S. turned inward. As American tariffs complicated traditional trade routes, Canadian and Mexican companies began forging direct partnerships, especially in the automotive and electronic sectors. In Baja California and Jalisco, Mexican manufacturers started sourcing Canadian steel polymers and high-quality lumber for consumer products bound for Latin America and Europe. Meanwhile, Canadian farmers found a strong new market in Mexico, shipping wheat, lentils, and dairy at competitive prices as U.S. goods became too expensive. The most overlooked detail: joint ventures began increasing fast. Canadian firms opened R&D centers in Monterrey, while Mexican companies invested in agritech pilot programs in Alberta. The two nations began sharing expertise in green infrastructure, cross-border logistics, and battery production, all without waiting on Washington's permission. And it worked. While Trump's tariffs fractured U.S., Canada ties Mexico, and Canada found common ground not just in trade but in resilience. The region's two middle powers stopped waiting for the big guy to lead and started building something more stable on their own. In a North America full of friction, Mexico became Canada's anchor of economic sanity and a key partner in rewriting the continent's future. Of all the countries Canada turned to during its trade crisis with the U.S., this one might be the most surprising: China. With years of tense diplomatic relations, political scandals, and growing Western skepticism, many assumed Canada would steer clear of Beijing. But when the Trump tariffs hit hard, economics spoke louder than politics, and the result was a surge in trade that few saw coming. In 2024, Canadian seafood exports to China tripled, crossing $1.4 billion in value. Lobster, crab, and Atlantic salmon became household staples in Chinese urban centers like Shanghai, Guangzhou, and Shenzhen. What once was a luxury became mainstream, all thanks to Canada's ability to deliver high-quality, traceable products that met China's rising food safety standards. But seafood was just the beginning. China's appetite for Canadian natural resources, especially energy products and minerals, soared. LNG shipments, forestry products, and even critical metals like cobalt and nickel began flowing east. Despite diplomatic tensions over issues like Huawei Hong Kong and the Meng Wanzhou affair, both nations kept the shipping lanes open. What truly caught analysts off guard was the rise in Chinese investment in Canadian clean tech. From electric vehicle battery recycling to green hydrogen projects in Alberta, Chinese firms saw Canada as a stable, resource-rich partner. At the same time, Canadian universities saw a resurgence in Chinese student enrollment, bringing in billions in tuition and local spending, particularly in cities like Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. While American leaders doubled down on nationalism and tariffs, Canada leaned into strategic pragmatism. Trade with China wasn't an ideological choice. It was a calculated one. The relationship remains complex, but both sides recognize the value of cooperation. After all, Canada has what China needs: resources, stability, and quality. And China offers what Canada needs: volume, demand, and investment. In the shadows of political drama, the shipping containers kept moving. And for Canada, that meant one thing: survival through smart trade, even with its most complicated partner. Stay informed. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next big shift. When the U.S. turned protectionist, Canada didn't just look west, it looked across the Pacific. In the midst of trade wars and economic uncertainty, one of Canada's fastest-growing trade alliances wasn't built on geopolitics, it was built on people. The Philippines, a nation of over 110 million with deep cultural ties to Canada, quickly emerged as a key player in Canada's pivot away from American dependency. By 2024, Canadian exports to the Philippines surged 35%, surpassing $2.3 billion. But what made this rise unique wasn't just the numbers, it was the diversity of sectors involved. Canadian meat, wheat, fertilizers, and agritech solutions became staples in Philippine markets. In parallel, Filipino businesses began investing in Canadian clean energy education services and food logistics, creating a two-way relationship that few predicted. Part of this success story lies in demographics. Over 900,000 Filipinos live in Canada, forming one of the country's largest and most vibrant immigrant communities. These connections aren't just cultural, they're economic engines. Filipino-Canadian entrepreneurs helped bridge the gap, introducing Canadian products to Manila while opening doors for Philippine exports like tropical fruit, seafood, and textiles. Even more telling: education. Filipino students now rank among the top international enrollees in Canadian universities, especially in healthcare engineering and environmental sciences. Their presence brings not just tuition revenue, but long-term trade synergies. Many go on to work in Canadian companies, eventually facilitating trade deals with firms back home. The relationship also gained depth through shared values, democracy, English language fluency, and strong service sector orientation. Canada's high standards in food safety, sustainability, and labor rights align closely with the Philippines' push for modernization and export readiness. In a region dominated by giants like China and Japan, the Philippines became Canada's agile, values-aligned partner, a country where cultural familiarity translated into economic trust. And with population growth and consumption on the rise, the Philippines isn't just a niche market anymore. It's a fast-moving flywheel of people products, and potential one that's now spinning firmly in Canada's favor. The global landscape is changing fast. Stay curious, stay aware, and keep asking questions. While much of the world focused on Canada's growing ties with major powers like Japan and the EU, another strategic player quietly stepped into the spotlight: Malaysia. Situated at the crossroads of global shipping lanes, Malaysia became a key part of Canada's Indo-Pacific expansion and a trade partner few saw coming. Under the CPTPP, Malaysia gained direct access to Canadian markets, but more importantly, Canada gained entry into one of Southeast Asia's most stable and diversified economies. By 2024, Canadian exports to Malaysia surged past $1.5 billion, driven by growing demand for seafood, wheat fertilizers, renewable energy tech, and aerospace components. But the real transformation came from deeper cooperation. Malaysia's booming electronics and semiconductor industries required high-purity metals and battery materials, exactly what Canada could provide. In return, Malaysian firms began exploring joint ventures in clean energy, hydrogen infrastructure, and biotech, especially in Alberta and Ontario. Meanwhile, the education link grew stronger. Canadian universities saw increased enrollment from Malaysian students, particularly in engineering and environmental sciences. These future professionals are forming the bridge between two economies with shared commitments to sustainability and innovation. Politically, Malaysia offered something rare in the region: non-alignment trade flexibility and a clear digital roadmap. It became a low-risk, high-potential partner for Canadian companies looking to avoid geopolitical entanglements while still gaining access to fast-growing ASEAN markets. Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy isn't just about big names like Japan or India. It's about building resilient networks across second-tier economies that offer long-term growth. And in that equation, Malaysia is becoming a hidden gem, an adaptable, resourceful ally helping Canada quietly reshape its presence in Southeast Asia. What began as a cautious partnership is now gaining momentum, and Canada's bet on Malaysia might be one of its most valuable moves yet. When Trump's tariff war pushed Canada to the brink, most people expected Ottawa to turn to big players: Europe, China, Japan. But few predicted that a small South American country with just 18 million people would become one of Canada's most strategic trade allies. Yet in early 2025, that's exactly what happened. Canada signed a free trade agreement with Ecuador, marking its 16th official trade pact worldwide, and perhaps its most quietly powerful. Why Ecuador? For one, it's rich in the exact resources Canada is looking to grow: agriculture, mining, and renewable energy. But more importantly, it holds a key position along the Pacific shipping routes, giving Canada direct access into broader South American markets without going through the U.S. Following the deal, exports of Canadian fertilizers, agritech, and clean technology systems began pouring into Ecuador. In return, Ecuadorian bananas, flowers, and seafood started filling Canadian grocery store shelves. But this agreement wasn't just about bilateral exchange, it was about building a network. Canada has now established trade agreements with 5 Latin American countries in less than a decade, including Chile, Peru, Colombia, and now Ecuador. This growing web of partnerships allows Canadian companies to bypass traditional supply chains dominated by the U.S. and instead build direct South-South trade corridors. Ecuador also offers political stability and pro-trade leadership, making it easier for Canadian businesses, especially small and medium-sized enterprises, to invest and operate in the region. Within months, Canadian firms began setting up satellite offices and logistics hubs in Guayaquil and Quito, while joint projects in sustainable agriculture and lithium exploration were already underway. While most headlines stayed focused on the tensions with Washington, Canada was quietly expanding its reach across the Andes. Ecuador, often overshadowed by its larger neighbors, became a critical piece in a much bigger puzzle. Sometimes it's the smaller doors that lead to the biggest opportunities. And Canada, under pressure, found exactly that in Ecuador, a silent but strategic gateway into Latin America's future. And just when it seemed like Canada was out of options, this happened. In the middle of rising global uncertainty and tariff wars, South Korea quietly became one of Canada's most important economic lifelines. The two nations had signed the Canada-Korea Free Trade Agreement (CKFTA) back in 2015, but the real impact of that agreement didn't fully emerge until Canada needed it most. When U.S. arms tariffs began hitting Canadian industries in waves. South Korea ramped up its imports of Canadian goods, turning what had once been a moderate partnership into a robust, high-growth relationship. By 2024, Canadian exports to Korea had climbed to over $12 billion, with significant gains in beef, seafood, lumber, canola oil, and fertilizers. But this wasn't just about raw commodities. South Korea's massive tech, auto, and electronics industries needed dependable inputs, critical minerals, clean energy components, allies, and high-quality agricultural inputs. And Canada had exactly that. Korean firms began sourcing more Canadian cobalt, lithium, and rare earth metals crucial to South Korea's battery and semiconductor sectors. Meanwhile, Canadian businesses gained a golden opportunity access to one of the most digitally advanced and innovation-driven markets in the world. From Vancouver to Seoul, Canadian and Korean companies started forming joint ventures in AI, biotechnology, hydrogen power, and quantum computing. And behind all of this was a shared set of values. Both nations prized rule-based, trade-transparent business practices and long-term technological cooperation. While political rhetoric dominated headlines in the U.S., Canada, and South Korea focused on quiet, consistent progress. Education also played a role. The number of South Korean students enrolling in Canadian universities jumped again in 2024, reinforcing not just economic ties, but cultural and generational bridges. In a world rattled by sudden tariff shocks and erratic leadership, South Korea offered Canada a rare combination of innovation, demand, and trust. Together, they built a blueprint for trade in the 21st century, tech-savvy, energy-efficient, and future-focused. Things only get more unexpected from here. Keep watching.